My dad looked at me one day after I had broken up with a boy that I'd kind of gone with as far as dating goes. We weren't able to date too much because we didn't go to shows and we didn't dance and all those things. We went to church a lot, but we had broken up, and my dad says, "Ruby, why don't you?" And I was out of high school. He said, "Why don't you go with somebody nice like Norman Rutzen?" I said, "Norman Rutzen?" I hardly knew the guy. He'd come through with one of our friends, and I'd met him, and he was actually going with an evangelist. I said, "Norman Rutzen?" I said, "Are you kidding me?" He's a preacher, and Norman was a very serious Christian. He was a serious Christian, and I really wasn't at that point. But anyway, we had met. He'd come through with some friends from a Bible college, isn't that right? Mm-hmm. First time. And he was going with a beautiful lady. Her name was Becky. And she could preach and teach, and she was beautiful. And I thought that was a done deal for this man. And I was kind of with a little beer drinker running around, and I wasn't a beer drinker. He was a beer drinker. But anyway, we broke up. And my dad was just really wanting me to settle into something better. So anyway, Norm came through again, and I met him again, and I was not interested. But then I eventually went to Bible college after I graduated from high school. And he drove up in front of the college with another young man named Wayne Nye. He and Wayne were good friends and loved each other. And a group of us were standing by the door when they came in, and I guess that the gift that my grandmother had hit me, and I knew that's the man I'm going to marry. And I didn't say a word about it. I went to my dorm. I kept quiet, and that's how we did get together, was at the Bible college.
The pivot point, and I think our relationship from my perspective was what she referred to the first day of opening classes at Conquer's Bible College in Portland. And when she walked in and I saw her, I thought, wow, I'm in the right place at the right time. And this is about the prettiest girl I've ever seen. And so at any rate, I think almost from the get-go, start, we felt attraction, I did, towards her. And I was asked to be the editor. That was the pioneer class of Conquer's Bible College. They had just opened it. Mm-hmm. I'll mention about that aspect maybe another segment. But anyway, they asked me to be editor of the first yearbook. And so I accepted. And I had photography experience, so I did most of the photography for the yearbook. And of course, they allowed me to choose who I needed to help with getting the book together. And of course, that was, I think, the first key the Lord gave me. I appointed her as the secretary and assistant of the yearbook project. So that gave us a chance to be together more than I think any of the other students.
Tell them the dating policy to begin with.
The regulations then was you got one date a month, and
chaperone.
You had to have a chaperone. Mm-hmm. Had to be adult, and I think preferably a staff member. So that isn't conducive to a really serious romance, but it worked out tremendously because we had an awful lot of annual business. So we got to spend a lot of hours in the little office there that I had because we had to take care of annual business. And I'll confess that there was a lot of hours spent there that was other than about the annual. And so that's how our romance started. We just had our one date a month. I remember the first date. I think Amelia Christensen was our first, and she was the ladies' dean of ladies, and she was our chaperone. And I remember on that first date, the first time I held Ruby's hand, I thought, wow, this is such a tiny little hand. But I remember the first time I held hands with her. And so anyway, it developed through the year, and it was getting spring. We was getting serious, and so part of the annual business was this big decision of the editor and the secretary making some plans of their own. And so we started talking about marriage, and we felt, I think, in agreement that it was the Lord's will, the Lord's plan, and so we...
Well, you graduated that same year from Bible college, and I was my
well,
first...
but this is leading up to that, and so anyway, we decided, well, we'd get married right after school was out. Our plans was that both of us would go to work in the cannery, which I'd been doing every year to work my way through Bible school. And so anyway, we had to pull off some kind of a deal to get married right after school's out. And you was not allowed to get engaged during school. That was another regulation of school. And so Ernest Moyer was the president. So we went in and had a talk with him because we wanted to send out wedding announcements. So we sat down in his office and I told him that a little resume of that we had fell in love. We felt like it was in the will of the Lord that we join our lives together and get married. And we wanted permission to send out wedding announcements. And we was going to get married a week after school was out.
Oh, Lord.
Because some of the ones who we wanted in our wedding had to go to their jobs and do their summer stuff. And so the best way to do that would be have it the week after school was out and everybody could then go do their thing. So when we mentioned sending out wedding announcements, he threw up his hand. Oh, no, no, no. He said, you can't do that. So anyway, however it happened, we kept talking, kept negotiating, and he finally decided, well, it was a good thing. So he said, well, okay, I'll let you send out announcements a week
ahead
before school was out. So we got our announcements set out, and we had, I think, had I wouldn't call it ideal, but it was a very wonderful time for us to have a chance to really get to know each other and get acquainted. We spent hours visiting together, and I felt like the Lord had put that open door for us of the project of the yearbook. And so at any rate, we made our plans, drove to Twin Falls, and I remember that I asked my father-in-law if he would consider loaning me $50. I hadn't, of course, my money was spent as far as school was concerned, and hadn't had a chance to work, so I do remember I asked him to borrow $50 to get married on.
To get married on,
yeah. Yeah, to get married on.
Well, you asked him for that you can marry me first, don't forget that. And
Oh.
we went to a restaurant, and we were sitting there, we took Mom and Dad out, and he was gonna ask Dad for my hand. That's what you did those days. And we had eaten, and we were sitting there, and finally my dad looked at him and says, Norm, you got something you wanna say? Dad was kind of to the point, and Norm told him that we wanted to get married. Of course, my dad and Mom were so excited. They loved this man, and thought I'd made a good choice, so.
He teased me, I think, the rest of our
Yeah.
our married life about me paying back that $50 I borrowed from him. I tried to tell him I did, but he'd kind of have fun questioning me about it. But anyway, we made our plans. We went out and gathered our own flowers. We couldn't afford to order flowers from flower shop. And at that time, the copper tone roses were in full bloom.
Yeah.
Nice branches of the copper tone roses, and that's what we decorated, I think, the arch with. And iris was out at that time.
Yeah.
And I can't believe now that we did this, but we went through Twin Falls, and we'd see these places that had a lot of them, and we'd knock on the door.
We did.
Ask the people if there's any possibility that they'd consider giving us some flowers for our wedding. I look back on that.
Oh, everybody was so excited. Absolutely. We just had flowers galore given to us.
So we gathered up our own flowers.
Yeah, we did.
And it was decorated pretty. There was a lady in the church that did the decorating,
Yes.
but we couldn't afford to buy the flowers. And so then the next challenge we had was the young men in the church there in Twin Falls where we was getting married had a custom of really giving newlyweds a bad time on the wedding.
Yeah.
And one of the favorite things they had was they'd separate the bride and groom. One would take the bride and one would take the groom, and take one out to Twin Falls and
Twin Falls.
and then
Yeah.
take the other to Shoshone Falls. And they're about what, 5 miles apart?
Yeah.
About 5 miles apart, and drop them off. Well, your wedding's in the evening and it's night, and so here you are, the bride's alone at one waterfall, and the groom is at the other, and it's up to them to get together. They thought that was big deal and a lot of fun, and you stop to think about it, it's really kind of.
It was not okay.
But anyway, that's what we had to contend with. So I was trying to decide how I could escape that. So I got in my head, if I made connection with a good sheriff member,
The sheriff already knew me, so we knew
and
him.
can't remember how the connection I made, but I got a hold of the right one. And so I asked him, is there any way that I could convince and persuade you to help us at our wedding? I told him what time our wedding was and approximately the time that the reception would start, and I said, if you would be willing to, we'd already made arrangements for the motel that we had reserved, and I asked him if he would consider coming in and getting us. And I don't know that I made the deal on the handcuffs or not.
No, I think
But anyway,
I think he did that for my sake.
but I made arrangements that he would come get us and take us in the sheriff's car and be sure that nobody followed us and knew where we was at, and then drop us off. So he agreed. So the reception started, and we were cutting the cake, and he had timed it just right, or however, anyway.
Yeah.
We had just got the cake cut, and in he walks, sheriff's uniform, walks over to the cake table and said, you Norman Rutzen? And I said, yes. He said, are you Ruby? And, yes. Pulled out his handcuffs and handcuffed us together. So then he led us out. Well, the guys couldn't do anything about it, and he took us in the sheriff's car, and he drove around Twin Falls and ditched the rest of them until we was free, and he dropped us off at the hotel.
Motel.
So that was an interesting aspect of our wedding, and that was the beginning of it.
Well, when I was just probably around 4, I had my first sweet encounter with a vision. It was during the Depression, and we didn't like I said before, we didn't realize we were poor because my family had plenty to eat and all that kind of stuff. But it was Christmas time. And my dad was a pastor of a small church there in Yakima, Washington. And on the back of that church was a kind of a little porch type thing. And it was Christmas time, like I mentioned before. And I walked out on that back porch and I looked up and there was a complete beautiful picture of the town of Bethlehem and the manger scene. And I'd seen it portrayed before in a little program, the little manger scene. But I saw that. That was such a gift to me. 4 years old, having that beautiful manger scene. And I never forgot. In fact, here I am in my 80s and almost could bring tears to my eyes thinking about it. And what a gift that particular thing was. Anyway, we just had so many experiences along life that drew me to the Lord and made me want to really serve the Lord. That's kind of one of my youth experiences.
Well, for me, it was from some of the experiences of the people who really cared and took my mother and I in, and I spent time in their family and their homes. So I had a very strong spiritual foundation footing. And there again, I honor my mother for a decision to go to Tulsa because it was there that I had my first real personal encounter with my decision. I was 10 years old. I had come to the altar multiple times and would cry and repent and ask God to forgive me. And my mother one day told me, said, "Norman, you've prayed and you cried and you've repented." Said, "Don't you think you should be baptized?" And she talked to me about it, and I decided that I should. And so 10 years old, I was baptized, and I came up out of the water. It was filled with the baptism of the Holy Spirit. And I had an amazing, marvelous spiritual encounter at 10 years old. And from that point on, there was never any question in my mind as far as my relationship with the Lord or my desire or purpose to live and serve the Lord. That was at 10.
Our first pastorate was in McCall. How that happened too, it was just another thing, how God just led our lives together. My aunt Grace Sweens was living up in Donley, which is very close to McCall. I don't know if you know anything about Idaho, but it's in beautiful country. It's real wooded area and beautiful. And she said, there's a little church in McCall that they haven't had a pastor for a long time. Would you be interested at all? This was just before we were married, right?
Well, we was in Twin Falls. She came down there.
Yeah.
That was about the first day, a day before we was married.
Yeah, because
She mentioned that to us.
we were both going to work the summer at the canneries in Washington. Well, anyway, you can tell that part of the story because she talked to you about going to...
Well, our plans were to go back to Walla Walla, and I had a position there already. They'd hire me right on to work, and we was going to make enough money that we'd get our bills paid up and the $50 paid back to your dad. And so anyway, Gracie mentioned this to us and said, "We'll give it some consideration." So we did. Well, we thought, we'll go through McCall on the way back to Walla Walla. And so we stopped and we found two families that were part of the church and sat down, visited with them, talked to them, told them who we were, and never met them before at all. And they took a liking to us, and they just almost begged us to consider coming back and being the pastor. So we left McCall, and we did pray about it. And that was kind of our honeymoon, our drive from McCall back to Walla Walla. We stopped and watched some construction for a little bit, some big construction. And So anyway, we was doing our visiting, and we did pray about it, got to Walla Walla, and we decided that was what the Lord wanted us to do. We just felt agreement in our heart. That was the direction. Rather than go to work at the cannery, let's go back to McCall. Yeah, we thought we're inexperienced, and but they don't have a pastor, so it's kind of level ground. We'll do our best.
We had a small group of people there. It was, and a lady was in charge of it. Sister Turner was.
So anyway, we made a decision, and maybe, well, I could mention that again too later. We had an experience on our way back to McCall that we've always wondered what the significance of it was. Anyway, I loaded up I had a hot Oldsmobile 88, and we was coming back and going over White Bird Pass, if you know where that's at. It's a lot of switchbacks. And we got down to the bottom of, well, it was up on the switchbacks, that we saw this man hitchhiking. He had the most unique, odd dress on. He had an odd hat.
Like a Canadian.
And he had this kind of a weird suit, or coat. I mean, it was just very unusual, just something you don't see hardly ever. And he was hitchhiking. Well, this was kind of our honeymoon trip, and I thought, well, it's not right to pick up a hitchhiker. Normally I would have, but I thought that's not right to pick up a hitchhiker. And
our car's packed full of stuff.
And so anyway, normally we'd have made room and put him in, and so we drove on by. We got farther down the road a few miles, and here's this guy again.
Same guy.
And still hitchhiking. And I looked at her, she looked at me, and I said, did anybody go around us?
Are you kidding?
And
no.
Not too many people went around me. I was a little heavy-footed with that 88 Olds, and I didn't remember anybody on those switchbacks passing us. I just couldn't think of anybody. And we looked at each other, and it puzzled us. So this guy, here he is. How did he get around us? So we were talking about it, and then thought, well, maybe we should have picked him up. And we drove on, and of course at that point then was watching, and nobody went around us. There was no car, no truck, nothing went around us. I kid you not, we pulled into Regan's,
Idaho,
which is down at the foot of the switchback area. Here's this guy had a board sidewalk going into Regan's. Here's this guy standing there beside the road.
Exactly.
Hitchhiking. He couldn't have been anybody else. The dress he had was so absolutely striking, unusual. He couldn't have been anybody else. And I don't think there's very little chance of there being two of the same kind. And we looked at each other, and I've wondered to this very day what the experience would have been if we would have stopped and picked him up. I have, at least an inclination in my heart, he might have had a message for us.
I don't know.
And I've always felt like that I maybe missed it. At least I wish now that I would have stopped and talked to him, because I still feel like it was what would I say, almost like supernatural manifestation. And what would have been the consequence or result or his word or message to us if we would have stopped and at least talked to him to see what he had to say. I wish we would have, but that's been one of the big question marks in my mind since we were married in our first endeavor of that fellow.
I looked at it just a little differently. I just felt like he was a guardian angel, because this guy drove fast around those curves and those switchbacks. I also wondered too what that was about. It was our first kind of weird supernatural experience there.
So anyway, we pulled into the little, I call it cottage.
I call it a shack. It was a shack.
It was kind of almost like cabin. He said it wasn't a log; it was a frame building.
Let me tell you about this house that the parsonage. They had brought these in from Stibnite, which was an old mining town in Idaho that had shut down years ago. So this is one of the houses that they bought in from that place and put on a foundation. Now,
So we pulled in, unloaded our car. We had stuff packed in there. We had got 5 green lamps, and they didn't match. There were 5 green lamps, and we thought, of course, you had to put up everything you got for your wedding.
Yeah.
So here's this little bungalow living room with 5 green lamps in it, and it had a wood cook stove. It had a wood heating stove. And that's what Rube started out on, was cooking on a wood cook stove.
poor Norm.
And so anyway, that first Sunday, we came in, and the lady that had been kind of in charge just got up and said, well, glad you're all here today. Said, we're glad to tell you that we have a new pastor. I want to introduce our new pastor, Norman and Ruby Rutzen. Come on up, it's all yours. That was the introduction.
That was it.
And so she strapped on the accordion, and I picked up the guitar, and we sang a few songs, and that was the launching of our pastoral ministry. We had some amazing experiences.
Honeymoon church,
There
those people
McCall.
loved us. And they were so glad to have a pastor that it was just, it was easy, one of the easiest places to pastor, really.
And we worked hard.
We did.
Of course, I had to make a living because there wasn't much of any income. And so I sold Singer sewing machines and vacuum sweepers. And I had some amazing stories connected with that. And but we did have some amazing experiences there in McCall. It took us very little time to understand and realize that we were in the will of God, and that we were on the path that the Lord
Yes.
had for us. We had a lot of interventions, I would feel, or protection from the Lord. One night, it gets cold in McCall, and that wood cook stove, that wood heating stove, wasn't working good, and the fella had brought down another stove. You see, you got to have a better stove than this. So I hadn't done wood heating stoves before, and he said, you bank it up. I said, what do you mean bank it up? Well, I said, basically fill it up, and he said, and then shut the vent down completely, and it should burn all night. Well, he didn't know anything, I don't think, about the stove. And in the night, I got up, I thought I smelled something. And I got up, and the little bedroom was just about just the width of enough room to get through the archway into the kitchen, between that heating stove and the bedroom. And when I got up, I smelt that, and I went out there. That wood heating stove was red hot. It was like a cherry. The whole thing was red. The wall was literally steaming, and the finish was kind of bubbling. It was, I would say, seconds within exploding on fire. And I ran into the kitchen and grabbed a couple pans, and I didn't know what else to do, but I had something there, and I got the door open, and I threw water in there. It blew soot and ash all over the living room. All I knew to do was get that thing cooled down, and I know it was the Lord that woke us up, because if that would have caught fire on that wall, we'd have been trapped in that little bedroom, because there's just a little doorway into it. So I really felt like the Lord spared our life on that. And we had wonderful experiences in McCall.
Norm was a great speaker, and they loved his ministry. He was he made sense, and he used the word, and both of us were gifted. I was gifted on the piano and the accordion. He played the guitar beautifully, and he sang really well. I wasn't that much of a singer, but that church was loving, and it grew. It was just what I call a honeymoon church. It was just wonderful. Everything was, it grew, and people came. The town's small. McCall was a logging country, logging up there. And they get to come home on the weekends. And it was just a wonderful place to live and start, because we were so loved in that community. And Norm worked so hard, and they loved Norm especially, I think. Well, they loved me too, but they really loved Norm because he was such a good pastor.
Well, they loved you. You was the one that was a people person.
Well, yeah.
But we did have wonderful experiences there. Mm-hmm. We treasure to this day our time there. It was a learning experience, mm-hmm. but the Lord granted us, I think, favor and grace to do a good work there, and we built up a good congregation. And of course, that opened the door to the next place you went to in Rupert.
I want to tell you about our first baptismal up there. Is it time to start that? It was really something. This great big gal, I mean, she was a big woman, wanted to be baptized in the creek up there, and that was Norm's first baptism.
In the lake, Pale Lake.
In the lake there. Yeah, it was in the lake, wasn't it? Anyway, he went out with her, and the rocks were slick with moss, and it was pitiful. I was so nervous about this, and he got her out there.
I should have had somebody with me to help me.
And she was like handling a wet walrus. She just slipped around in his arms. Anyway, he got her baptized, and I was absolutely one nerve knot by the time that.
I like to never got her up out of the water.
Yeah. She was baptized thoroughly, and she probably never forgot it. We never forgot that was his first baptism. Oh, gosh. I'll never forget that one. It was something.
She not only got wet, she got soaked.
And then we had our first wedding up there. It was two couples that came out of the mountains up there. I mean, they were mountain people. They weren't pretending or anything. They're very uneducated, but they wanted to get married by a preacher, and we were the preacher there in that little mill town in McCall. And so they got their marriage license. They were all ready to go. And so Norm took him over to the little church, and you married him inside the church, didn't you? Mm-hmm. I think I played the piano for him, had a little ceremony for him. It was real sweet. There was two couples, the married couple and then the people that were witnesses. And afterwards, they wanted all their pictures taken. And no kidding, they wanted us to be in the pictures, and all of them, they didn't put their arms around each other's waist. They all draped around each other, like this. And there was Norm. He's kind of a sophisticated guy, and trying to be the preacher, And that guy just cuddled him right into his arms and fully pulled us all together. It was funny. That was our first marriage, wasn't it?
Yeah, I think so.
Forever. And he's married hundreds of people since then. He still has people asking him to marry them. And McCall as well. We had, from that experience there years ago, in Idaho, where Norm's asked to speak at funerals clear up and down that valley now, still. So it turned out to be a real pleasant, wonderful experience. Rupert was a small farming community, and the pastor there had built, it was the largest Pentecostal church in probably the Northwest at that time, and he was a friend of ours, and he came and visited with us and asked Norm if he would be interested in going to Rupert to pastor because he was going to leave there, and it was like coming full circle for me because I was born there and was in the parsonage when I was born there. Pastor that loved Norm and I, and they invited us, and that was a pretty big undertaking for newbies like we were. And so when we moved to Rupert, I don't have the year down, but Norm was a great speaker. By then we'd had about 4 years under our belt, so we took that church, which was the largest Pentecostal church in Idaho at that time. And it was a wonderful farm church, but boy, those people were used to that great pastor that they had, Pastor Adams, Carl Adams. And he was a hard act to follow. He would go visit in homes and was a real pastor, like I think pastors still should be. Back to pastoring in Rupert, they loved their former pastor. I mean, so much. It was just, and he was a go-getter. He really was. He was very interesting, powerful preacher, and they just loved him. And he not only pastored, he went to homes just to visit. He'd just pop up and show up, and they loved that at that juncture. You guys probably wouldn't so much now, but they loved that. And man, I'm telling you, that was a hard one to follow because Norm was a little bit shyer. He wasn't as social as this other pastor, but anyway, it turned out all right. But boy, it was a challenge to pastor there. It really was.
I would just like to say about pastoring. Probably we approached it a little differently than some people. But to me, pastoring is one of the most honorable but demanding careers, if you want to call it careers. It's really calling. Jesus compared us to shepherds. And he said, the good shepherd, him, giveth his life for the sheep. There's a certain point in a pastor's life, true pastor, that he literally lays his own life on the line for the welfare and the well-being and the care of the sheep that the Lord's given him responsibility for. And so from that standpoint, pastoring does put demands, and it carries a price with it, but it also has a rich reward. And but pastoring to a certain extent is somewhat of a calling outside the scope of a lot of careers. I don't like to call pastoring a career. It truly is a calling.
I think the struggle for me was when you've served people well and you've loved people and have done your best. Maybe it's not enough, but you've done your best for them, and they can walk away from you. And that has always and still is a very difficult thing for me to understand, how you can become so much a part of someone's life, bury their children, marry their children, but they get to a certain point and they can just kind of walk off and maybe go to another group without any real offense or anything you don't even really know. That is painful for me, and especially, of course, we're not pastoring now, but watching the shuffle between churches and people changing, that was very difficult for me. I felt betrayed, but I heard Pastor Jake say something, and he said, some people are like scaffolding in your life. They're there for a time when you're building something or doing something, and then they go away. And that helped me kind of think about that a little bit better, because Norm and I really loved our congregants. We loved our people. I can't tell you how many funerals this man's had. I wish we'd have kept records, because hundreds probably of funerals and weddings for people not just in our congregation but in our community. But that was the hardest, that was a struggle for me. And to see some of our families divorce and separate after you see them come together, and you see it starting to happen, and how Satan kind of sets up their demise. And you know it. Norm has a gift, or had a gift, and we haven't experienced it one time. We had a wonderful couple in our church, and they were up front people, right up there in front. And the Lord gave Norm a complete vision of what the dad was doing. It wasn't good. You can want to tell them about that. They're both gone, so it doesn't matter. The story doesn't matter about Armin and
Well, I think it was just part of God's equipping me or providing me the gifting to help save, redeem people. And this man was a marvelous gifted man, talented. And but he was in the process of a relationship that was going to destroy his family. I wasn't aware of it. But the Lord gave me this, I'd call it a vision, whatever. But I saw him take this woman. I could have drove to the exact place. I saw the place, I saw the motel, I saw the name of it. I saw details of this process that was in the making. And I decided that I couldn't withhold it, because if I did, and it happened, it would probably destroy his family. It would be a devastation to our church because of his position. Mm-hmm. And so I said, I need to meet with you, and let's sit down and have a visit. And so I talked to him, and I said, I'm not accusing you. I'm not making any kind of accusation. I just want to tell you what I feel like the Lord has showed me to try to help you. And so I told him the scenario. As I was telling him this, he just almost became, his face turned almost whitish, and I could tell it was just absolutely striking him with a devastating force, and it resulted in the salvation of his family.
It did.
He knew it, and he acted on it, and because I would have had no way of knowing any of that information had the Lord not given it to me. Mm-hmm. And so for me, that's partly the role of pastoring. Pastoring is the role of a shepherd. The good shepherd gives his life for the sheep. Jesus was referred to as the good shepherd. And as a shepherd, I felt like that's the call that God gave me, was a shepherd. And so that's what was sort of the trademark or the goal of our life. I think I was a little motivated by the fact of my background and some of the situations that we've already discussed some. I always sort of felt a drive or a necessity to prove my worth and to validate my qualifications or value as a person. So maybe some of my motivation was that. But I do know that I have felt the call of ministry was such an honorable and a blessed thing, but it is also one of commitment and sacrifice. But it's by no means what would I say, a negative thing. It is a positive thing. And I just feel like that it was an honor for the Lord to have chosen me as a shepherd, and whatever I could do along the way to make a difference was going to be worth any effort that I could put into it.
I don't know if this is the time to tell about this man, honestly. He has so many gifts, not just in the pulpit. He was a pulpit minister. He could teach the word, preach. He built campgrounds. He built us a beautiful church that we're in now. If you ever go to Caldwell, it's right on the freeway. Beautiful, beautiful church. And he has built our home. I can't say enough about this guy. He has been, besides that, he's a gifted listener. He's really, if you ever need a good pastor, call him.
I have felt, had hoped that my wife could accommodate and accumulate a better sense of her value and worth in our ministry. I think a lot of times I was in the pulpit. I was the one who would be referred to or mentioned and so on. Mm-hmm. But I couldn't have done or couldn't have been anything I was if I had not had her support and her talent and her ability. She's at times not fretted, but kind of felt like she wished she would have had another career. But I've wanted her to understand and know that she is absolutely equal in any kind of accommodation or blessing that we have been. She's had her role in that. She's made the difference in so many lives. She couldn't have had any kind of a career, absolutely no career I could ever think of, that she would have affected and blessed and been more valuable to so many people than she has been. And there isn't any kind of career that she could have done that she would have been any more successful or done more well at. She is a world-class mom. I've introduced her a lot of times as the world's best pastor's wife. She's just been exceptional. And so I just think it's wonderful the Lord gave us a chance to work together.
Yeah,
and do the work of the Lord.
That's true. But I was in that generation, transition generation, where women mostly stayed at home. Period. That we just did. And with my mother, like, she never drove. She didn't just go shopping when she wanted to. Dad took her and that kind of thing. And I started being pastor's wife in the 50s, 52. We were married in 54, so yeah. And I was pulled between being a career person or and for me, a pastor's wife represented somebody that took care of every need of the church. Man, I did the nursery, I did Sunday school, I was a ladies' leader. I mean, you could ride yourself ragged doing all that kind of stuff. And I never felt like, I always thought I would have liked to have had a career maybe too outside that would have given me some, I don't know, it's past. So, but I was just pulled between two generations, actually, where the pastor's wife was just, that's it. That's what you were, the pastor's wife. You didn't do other things. But as time went on, I thought, oh, shoot, I wish I'd have maybe been a nurse or something, or a social worker or something. Anyway, that didn't happen, and I think I fulfilled my destiny. Okay.
Absolutely. And in marvelous fashion. When I began my ministry, I was licensed with the United Pentecostal Church. From almost the initial year, which was the first year I pastored in McCall, I held a office of some kind. Started out with the Northwest District Sunday School secretary, and from then on I had some kind of position. At one point I had 3 positions, one on the General Board, one on the Harvest Time Commission, and then also on the Home Missions. I appreciated the fellowship and the experience in that fellowship, and really committed a lot of my life, ministry, and travel to it. But they reached a point where their concept of some of the holiness issues were not acceptable from my standpoint, and I tried to be as cooperative and compliant as possible, but I had a lot of people that trusted, I think, in our leadership to be reasonable and moderate, I guess would be the right term to use in some of the physical, visible standards in terms of holiness. And this became a contentious issue within the fellowship till it came to a point where a resolution was passed by the National Convention that required you to sign a statement. I could not conscientiously sign that statement. It basically entailed confessing or admitting that you believed in those things all stipulated in their manual, and that you would preach and enforce those standards in your church. I couldn't do that, so I refused to sign. As a result, I was dropped when I didn't sign that. That was at the same time that my father-in-law, that I respected and honored so much, had held the same position I did. We had consulted often between us, and he refused to sign it as well. And he had been one of the oldest members of their administrative board, and he also was dropped. So that left us in a no man's land, and we'd always been associated and connected with other believers of like faith. And so it was quite a traumatic experience for us in some respects, because this was a total change of direction. People that we have spent years in sharing ministry and projects, and our ministerial life really circled in that realm. And suddenly this was changed. So I immediately, on the way home from Salt Lake City, where this conference was held, we were driving along, and my wife felt the same thing. She felt like, because we were really emotionally touched, affected, wondering, where do we go from here? What's going to be the direction of our ministry? How are we going to function now? And but my wife felt like there was just
stuff was just dropping off of our car. It was just like, we were out there in the desert, and it was a good feeling. Like things were just dropping off of us that we had been encumbered with. It was an actual feeling.
And we just felt like that the Lord had a future for us. We didn't know exactly what it was, but we were certainly going to survive. It wasn't going to affect us.
No, it wouldn't affect our church, local church, too much.
But it was a big thing for them, because part of what was mentioned earlier, the campgrounds at McCall, that had been part of their life, and all the activities of that fellowship had been part of their church life. So we had to go home and share this with her church. And we assured them that they was not going to lose those things, that we would see to it that we had something. Well, I made a commitment that was pretty big for me as an individual, to promise and to commit to them. And so we immediately began to consult with a number of our close associates and friends, and shared these times with Norm. And we came to the conclusion that the best thing for us was to form another association, that we could retain a lot of those friendships and fellowship people that we had spent years of ministry with, that we could still have a connection and somehow share some ministries together. So as a result, the original meeting, organizational meeting, after I had spent a lot of time traveling with to different places and consulting with men calling, and we set the meeting for our church in Caldwell, the old site, the old location. And so there were men came from all over the United States to that meeting, and resulted in the beginning of the formation of the International Network of Ministries. A few years later, we joined and connected the global network group, which was smaller and was really kind of shrinking, and connected with them and joined together, and then it became known as the Global Network of Christian Ministries. Our first few months was spent traveling various places in the States, having what we just called circle meetings of men going through for some of them was traumatic. Their ministry was taking a change and a turn. There's a camaraderie among pastors and ministers that's really quite a strong bond of laboring, working together on the same projects. And for some of these men, they all face the same thing of what are we going to do, where are we going to go from here. And then also it was a time of spiritual examination and questioning. They had to decide what they really believed. For years they had followed what an organization had determined in their councils and resolutions as to what was required and what was stipulations. And that was basically determined for everybody because of the organizational structure. For some, that was safety. It was something they relied on, and they were very dependent upon that. Some of us were a little more independent as far as our own ministry is concerned. So we had to help walk these men through that process. For some, it was very traumatic. We'd sit in a big circle, and some of them would literally, I'd say, confess and ask forgiveness for their attitude and for the direction that they'd followed and some of their concepts. And it was, without understanding and knowing the integral parts of it, it's hard to describe this, but it was quite a heart-wrenching experience to see these seasoned ministers, some of the older ministers, weeping and asking forgiveness. It was a very moving experience to help walk these men through this transition of their ministry. That was back in years when there wasn't near the independent structure that there is now. There's so many churches have started and that are inclusive to the point that you can connect yourself to just about anything you want. There's so much more, choice now. Back then, denominational structure was very strong in our whole country. You was part of some of the national denominations, or you wasn't much of anything. To be independent was kind of a brave thing. Well, now, in reality, there's more independent churches than there is organizational churches. Organizational churches, to a great extent, are diminishing. A lot of them are populated with the older generation that is getting old and dying off, and some of them are not very attractive to the younger generation and new concepts and so on.
Can I mention this? One of the things that was the deal breaker for us in particularly, they didn't want any televisions in people's homes because they saw and we still see the bad side of that. But they weren't looking forward to technology because everything was a warning, it was worldly or something. So it just seemed like that you couldn't have television in your home, and they didn't want people in the church to have television. And it just got beyond the pale because that was already starting to be a very viable news source, and so it was kind of over that. That was the biggest issue, don't you think?
Well, yes, there was, in general, the holiness, which there was a transition. A lot of things were changing. A lot of people were abandoning some of their very conservative positions on things.
Yeah.
So in many of the districts and states, it depended on the administration how strict and rigid they were on this. So anyway, there was around 40, I better get my numbers together here. There was close to 4,500 men at that time made the choice not to sign that affirmation.
We had to sign an affirmation that we wouldn't have television in our home.
That we would teach, abide by, and practice all of those things that were in the manual. That was a commitment that had to be made. And so we spent quite a few months traveling, helping these men get their spiritual bearings. Some never did. Some of them just kind of cut the ties loose, and some, not a lot, but there were some that really never did get their feet back on the ground. A number of men lost their churches because the churches felt they wanted to stay affiliated with the national organization. And so if the pastor didn't, well, then the pastor was out. I had a good friend in Texas that had just built a brand new, beautiful church facility, and that became an issue, and he had to eventually walk off from that new building that he had overseen and just got built and start from scratch again.
Yeah.
So anyway, Norm was involved in that organizational meeting. He had a part in, and you submitted the name, didn't you?
Global?
Statement of purpose.
I guess maybe the statement of purpose in, anyway, was part of it. But we got that going, and that took a lot of our time. I look back on it now and wondered how we kept all of the balls in the air trying to keep everything going, and pastoring a church and the other responsibilities that we had. And but it took a lot of effort on our part. We had conferences, meetings across the country. We ended up with it was around 4,500 ministers that joined at that initial period of time.
And Norm was their leader.
And,
He was the head of it.
They asked me to take the leadership of that, and I did so for several years. And then we eventually merged with the global network, as I mentioned, and added them to it. At that time, their director and I voluntarily resigned, and Jabbo Green from Spring, Texas, became the chairman. That became our circle of fellowship and minister relationship from all those years until just recently. To me, that was I call it monumental, but it was a huge thing for a lot of men all across the country, from coast to coast, to provide a ministerial friendship and fellowship and relationship to have to link together with others. And so we felt very fulfilled in having a part in getting that launched, initiated, and formed. Well, the church camp played a big part in my life because of the Bend Camp meeting. That was years ago. And as a teenager, I remember the life-changing experiences I had at Bend. Then, at that time, the organization that we were in included the whole Northwest, and that campgrounds was in Bend, Oregon. When the district divided into each state, that campgrounds was sold. And Then also that we had the Bible school, and it was owned by the whole district. When it divided, why then the school was divided, and so Idaho got some of the money from the campgrounds, a third of that money. And so with that, we bought the Bethel Park campgrounds. We knew about that when we pastored there. So we was in on the ground floor of that. At that time, we'd moved from McCall to Rupert. And so I was a youth president at that time of the Idaho district, Northwest at that time. Anyway, we led the way in developing the campgrounds. We had to log it, take the timber off of it. We started with the tabernacle, and I got permission from the district to promote the building of the tabernacle by the youth. And they sold boards for the tabernacle. It was tongue sticks stamped with Bethel Park. And we sold enough of those through the youth department to build the original tabernacle on the campgrounds. And that campgrounds became a gathering point for all the churches of our fellowship. And a lot of young people, well, a lot of married people now recall and remember those experiences they had at Bethel Park. And then we developed the lodge. So it was largely under our leadership that whole campgrounds was developed. And that was one of our greatest, I felt, achievements or projects that we spearheaded. And it was the result, it resulted in the transformation and encouragement and really destiny of a lot of young people's lives. We had tremendous meetings there.
Yes.
And that was one of our great experiences.
In fact, it even today, as even last week, I think somebody called your age group, Josh, that would like to have a reunion up at that campground. It was just a beautiful, beautiful place, and your grandpa here was largely responsible for that with his ingenuity and his skills and pushing it and work. We all had to work together, and I cooked outside in a tent for a bunch of workers, and I really wasn't that good at cook, but they liked macaroni and meat, so we had it made, you know. But I credit Norm, your grandpa, for that dream and that idea, and we still get calls all the time wanting a reunion at that camp. So it hasn't died yet. But another group bought that, and they won't rent it out to anybody. So unless we get a miracle, they probably won't rent it out to us. I don't think. I don't know.
Mom shared in that, and I know there's a lot of times she worried at night because she never knew when I'd get home with the trips that I made up there to the campgrounds. But one time especially, and of course back then we didn't have cell phones, and the other workers had left, and I wanted to backfill against the foundation of the lodge. And I was running the backhoe, and I moved this one boulder, and it went farther than I wanted it to and got close to the foundation. So I put the bucket down and got off the backhoe and was going to put the dirt between the foundation and this big boulder. And in the process, that boulder turned loose and pinned my knee between that rock and the foundation. And I, to this day, believe it had to be the Lord that helped me get my leg out from behind that rock against the foundation. I'd have been stuck there, well, probably in the middle of the night. She'd known something was wrong and sent somebody to look for me. But anyway, the Lord helped me get my knee out of there. I crawled back to up on the back, by the backhoe to where I could turn it off. And I had to crawl. I couldn't walk on it back to the pickup, and drove home that night. And I think that's one of the reasons why I had to have my knees replaced. But there was a lot of things that happened there. Mom was up there with me a lot. So that was a big investment of our life. And we was pastoring at the same time too. So it was a time of real commitment on our part.
Yeah.